The heat hung over San Marco like a veil. Dust rose from the ground and never settled, clinging to windows, horses, and faces until everything carried the same dull color of the earth. The hills shimmered in the distance, red and dry, their edges blurred by the trembling air. Even at night, the wind carried the taste of dust, mixed with sweat, iron, and something older, the slow decay of a land that had seen too much. Evelyn Hart arrived at dusk. The stagecoach wheels ground against the stones as it came to a halt in front of the inn. She stepped down carefully, holding her skirt to keep it from the dirt. The driver tipped his hat, but she did not look back. The town greeted her with silence. A few men outside the saloon, a dog sleeping under a wagon, a church bell somewhere far away, ringing without urgency. She had seen towns like this before, places that forgot themselves between one summer and the next. Her room was small, with a single window overlooking the street. The wallpaper had faded, the bed creaked, and the water in the basin smelled faintly of rust. But it was quiet, and that was all she needed. She unpacked a single trunk, a few dresses, a book, and a folded photograph she did not unfold. Outside, the last light sank behind the ridge, and the sound of boots and voices faded into the distance. Days passed with a kind of measured stillness. She found work at the general store, keeping the ledger for the owner, an old man whose eyes watered in the dry air. She liked the order of numbers, the neatness of lines. People came and went, buying flour, salt, nails, speaking little and watching her only in passing. San Marco was a place where strangers could disappear, but not be forgotten. She understood that and kept her head down. In the afternoons, the heat thickened, the horizon trembled, and the air filled with the drone of flies. Evelyn swept the porch, wiped the counters, and pretended not to notice when conversations stopped as she passed. At night, she walked to the edge of town, where the land opened into the wide emptiness of the plains. The sky there seemed larger, the stars sharper, as if the darkness itself was alive. She stood still until her thoughts grew quiet. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, a rider entered the town. His horse was gray, streaked with sweat, and his coat carried the pale dust of travel. He rode with the ease of someone who had lived more in the saddle than on the ground. Evelyn watched from the window as he dismounted in front of the saloon, handed the reins to a boy, and disappeared inside. Later, she saw him again, this time helping a child pick up a fallen bucket in the street. The gesture was simple, almost careless, yet it caught her attention. There was something in his movements, unhurried, resigned, that mirrored her own weariness. After that, she noticed him more often, at the blacksmith's, leading his horse to water, standing in the shade near the store. He did not seem to belong to the town any more than she did. People greeted him, but not as one of their own. He carried that quiet distance, familiar to those who had lost more than they could speak of. The days stretched into one another. The rhythm of San Marco was the same, the morning dust, the ring of the doorbell, the shuffle of boots, the low murmur of trade. Evelyn began to feel that she could almost disappear into it, a shadow behind the counter, a name no one asked. But the past, like the dust, did not settle. It drifted after her, invisible and constant, following every step she took through the narrow streets. At night, when the wind swept through the alleys and the lanterns flickered, she sometimes thought she heard the creak of a coach wheel, the sound of pursuit. Then it would fade, and she would tell herself it was only the wind, only the ghosts of the plains. Still, she kept her trunk packed beneath the bed, just in case the road called again. Weeks drifted by, each one dissolving into the next with the quiet rhythm of dust and heat. San Marco moved slowly, as if the sun itself held everything in its grasp. Evelyn had grown used to the pattern of her days, the mornings spent counting ledgers in the store, the afternoons heavy with stillness, the evenings when the horizon turned to copper and the wind carried the scent of dry sage and smoke. She rarely spoke more than she needed to. Words in this town traveled faster than wagons. Jonas Kell was still there. He had taken work on the outskirts of town, mending fences, shoeing horses, driving cattle when the ranchers needed an extra hand. Some said he had drifted south from Abilene. Others thought he'd come from nowhere at all. He moved like a man used to silence. In the mornings, Evelyn sometimes saw him at the well, sleeves rolled, his hands darkened with dust and sweat. In the evenings, he would ride through the main street, a quiet figure outlined against the sinking light. He always nodded when he passed the store, the gesture brief but certain. Evelyn told herself it meant nothing. He was like the rest of them, just another man passing through, just another face that would fade with time. Yet she noticed how he lingered, how his shadow fell across the same places day after day. Once, she caught him watching a storm form over the hills, the brim of his hat tilted low, his expression unreadable. There was something in that stillness that felt familiar, the same way she stood at her window when night fell, waiting for nothing but the dark. The women of San Marco had begun to talk. They did not speak loudly, but their eyes said enough. Evelyn felt their glances when she walked to the well, when she entered the store, when she brushed the dust from her skirt. They sensed something unfit in her, something that didn't belong to their narrow world of prayer, gossip, and obedience. Her walk was too measured, her gaze too steady, her hands too clean of surrender. She had learned long ago that a woman who carried silence differently could be read as dangerous. One afternoon, she stood behind the counter as two women whispered near the shelf of flour sacks. Their voices were thin, sharp as needles. Someone in the next county was looking for a woman accused of deceit, a woman who had taken money from a merchant and vanished before dawn. The story drifted between them like smoke, deliberate and cruel. Evelyn kept her face still, her hands busy. When the doorbell chimed and they left, their laughter followed like a trail of dust. That evening, the sun bled out behind the ridges. The air turned metallic with the scent of rain that would never come. Evelyn sat by the window, her reflection faint in the glass, watching the street where the light dimmed by the minute. Across the road, Jonas led a horse toward the stables, its hooves striking softly against the packed earth. The moon caught on his shoulder, clinking off the brass buckle at his belt. He moved unhurriedly, like a man at peace with the weight he carried. She wondered what it would be like to be that kind of quiet, to have the world take you as you were, without questions, without memory. When the last lanterns went out, the town sank into its usual stillness. The air outside was restless, filled with the long cry of the wind sweeping through empty corrals. Evelyn lit a small lamp and knelt beside her trunk. From its depths she drew a wrapped bundle, worn from years of being folded and unfolded. Inside lay a photograph, faded and thin at the edges, and a golden chain that caught the lamplight. She traced the outline of the man in the picture, his face stern, his posture proud, the sort of man who believed he could own a person's life by law or promise. The name written on the back had been struck through with ink so dark it bled through the paper. She placed the photograph aside and sat there, the chain hanging loosely between her fingers. For a long while she listened to the sound of the wind pushing against the shutters. Somewhere beyond the street, a horse neighed, followed by the echo of hooves, fast, urgent, disappearing into the dark. The noise grew louder for a heartbeat, then faded into nothing. She did not move. The silence that followed was deep enough to make her hear her own breath. In that stillness, she felt the old fear return, the one she thought she had buried beneath miles of road and dust. She had lived long time running from names, from places that remembered her too well. The road was always there, waiting, like a shadow that stretched farther than daylight. Yet San Marco had begun to sink into her, the rhythm of it, the sameness of its mornings, the faint comfort of being unseen. She rose, placed the photograph back into its wrapping,
and set it carefully inside the trunk. Her hands lingered on the lid before she closed it. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain and distant thunder. She went to the window again, where the town lay motionless under the pale moon. Somewhere out there, she knew, the world was still searching. But here, for the first time in a long while, she hesitated. Maybe she could stay until the next change of season. Maybe she could let the dust cover her tracks a little longer.
By the time the men arrived, the town was already awake to their presence. Two riders, both wearing dust-stained coats and the weight of miles behind them, came down the main road just after dawn. Their horses moved slow, deliberate, the sound of hooves hollow in the morning stillness. One of them wore a badge that caught the light like a small, cruel sun. The other rode slightly behind, eyes scanning the street with the caution of someone used to being unwelcome. San Marco had seen lawmen before, but not the kind who stayed long enough to ask names. The marshal dismounted first, stretching his back, the leather of his gloves creaking. He spoke briefly to the stable boy, then to the innkeeper, then to anyone who happened to cross his path. The photograph he carried was small, but it changed hands over and over that day. A glimpse of a woman's face, pale and faint, as if printed from memory more than ink. Most who saw it shook their heads, but their hesitation was noticeable, a pause too long before they answered. By noon, everyone knew what was being asked, even if no one said her name. Evelyn heard about them before she saw them. The whispers reached the store first, carried by the wind in the mouths of those who had too much time and too little mercy. She felt it settle over her like a thin layer of dust. She kept working, her hands steady, her expression blank. But inside, her thoughts moved fast, calculating, the old rhythm of fear rising like an instinct. It was near evening when the doorbell chimed, and the two men stepped into the store. The marshal walked with the weary authority of someone who had spent his life chasing people who never wanted to be found. His companion lingered near the doorway, brushing the dust from his coat. The air inside grew heavy. Evelyn's heart clenched once, sharp and quick, then fell into silence. Without a word, she slipped through the narrow door at the back and into the storage room. The faint smell of grain and oil hung in the air. She crouched behind the barrels, every sound magnified, the creak of the floorboards, the low murmur of voices. The marshal's tone was calm, almost kind, as he spoke to the storekeeper. He asked the same questions she had heard before in other towns. Had they seen a woman traveling alone, quiet, polite, but secretive? Someone who kept to herself, who might use another name. Then came the sound she dreaded, paper sliding across the counter, the hush of recognition that followed. She pressed her palms against her knees and closed her eyes. Through the thin wall, she heard the marshal say her name. He said it softly, not like an accusation, but like a memory. The sound of it reached her like a cold wind. For a moment, she almost believed he pitied her. Then came the scrape of boots, the closing of the door, and the fading steps outside. When all was still, she remained in the dark for a long time before she dared to move. When she finally stepped out, the room felt smaller, the air thinner. The storekeeper stood behind the counter, staring at the closed door where the lawman had gone. His expression was unreadable, but his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the ledger. He didn't ask, and she didn't explain. The silence between them was enough. After a moment, he nodded toward her trunk upstairs. His voice, when it came, was low and tired. He told her that she should leave by morning. That night, Evelyn packed without thinking. Her movements were careful, almost detached. The photograph went into her pocket, the chain around her neck. Outside, the wind had picked up again,
scattering the dust in long, restless swirls. She lay awake on the bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the first trace of light to break through the curtains. At dawn, she stepped into the street. The town was quiet, only a few shapes moving in the pale mist that rose from the ground. Her bag was light. She had learned to carry only what she could abandon. As she walked toward the edge of town, she saw a figure waiting by the hitching post. Jonas, his hat pulled low, the gray horse beside him. He didn't look surprised to see her. The morning light made his face unreadable. He simply gestured to the saddle, and she hesitated for only a moment before climbing up behind him. They rode in silence, the hooves kicking up small clouds that caught the rising sun. The road out of San Marco was narrow and lined with thorn brush. The air was dry and cold, the kind that burned the lungs. Neither spoke. The dust filled the space between them, thicker than words, heavier than trust. Jonas guided the horse steadily, eyes fixed ahead. He didn't ask what she was running from. He didn't need to. The way she sat, tense, quiet, her hands clutched in her lap, told him enough. He had seen that kind of fear before, the kind that came not from guilt, but from being hunted too long. When they reached the old bridge, the boards groaned beneath the horse's weight. Below, the riverbed lay cracked and empty, a thin trickle of water glinting in the sun. Evelyn's voice never came, but her movement did. She slipped down from the saddle, her boots sinking slightly into the dust. She stood there for a moment, unsure which way to go. The horizon stretched before her, endless and cruel. Jonas stayed seated, holding the reins loosely, watching her. His face gave nothing away, but when he spoke, his tone was even, almost cautious. He told her of a house by the river, abandoned, half-fallen, but dry and hidden from the road, a place where she could stay until the trail behind her cooled. She turned, meeting his gaze. There was no plea in his eyes, no promise, only the quiet understanding of one drifter recognizing another. She nodded once, almost inconceivably, and followed the direction of his glance. The sun climbed higher, burning away the mist. By the time the dust settled, they were gone from the road, leaving nothing but faint tracks that the wind soon began to erase.
The house stood low in the bend of the river, half swallowed by willows whose branches hung like curtains against the wind. It had once belonged to a family of farmers, though nothing remained of their presence but a broken plow rusting in the weeds and a few warped boards leaning where a barn used to stand. The roof sagged under the weight of time, and the windows were nailed shut, their glass long gone. When Jonas led the horse through the thicket and dismounted, the place looked less like a refuge and more like a grave of forgotten years. But Evelyn said nothing. She simply stood there, her face pale beneath the shade, and watched as he tied the reins to a post that had not held anything living in years. He worked without words. The hinges of the door protested when he forced them open, but soon the stale air spilled out, thick with dust and the faint smell of river mud. Inside, the walls still held the color of smoke, the corners filled with cobwebs. Jonas set down his saddlebag, struck a match, and built a small fire in the hearth. The flames caught slowly, the smoke curling upward in thin, uncertain lines. Evelyn swept the floor with a branch she found outside, her movements steady, deliberate. It was not comfort, but it was safety, and that was enough. By nightfall, the air grew colder. The fire cracked softly as Jonas mended the door, fitting a loose plank against the frame. Evelyn watched from across the room, her knees drawn close beneath her skirt. The flicker of light made her face seem younger, though her eyes remained the same, alert, waiting for something unseen. When the door finally held, Jonas straightened, brushing the sawdust from his hands. He left her the blanket from his saddle roll and stepped outside to tend to the horse. Through the broken walls, she could see the river glinting faintly in the moonlight, moving slow and soundless between the reeds. In the days that followed, time began to lose its edges. Mornings came gray and cool, with mist rising from the river like breath. Jonas left early, taking the same narrow path through the trees, his figure disappearing into the hills. Evelyn stayed behind, filling the silence with small labors. She patched the holes in the roof with old boards, cleaned the hearth, and mended clothes by the fire. The sound of the river became her companion, constant, patient, the kind of sound that didn't demand to be listened to. Each evening, when the sky turned to gold and the air filled with the scent of smoke and wet earth, Jonas returned. Sometimes he brought bread, sometimes salt, sometimes coffee wrapped in brown paper. They shared what little they had without ceremony. He sat by the fire, and she poured water into a dented pot, stirring it with a quiet precision that belonged to someone who had once known a different kind of life. Between them, words were scarce but unnecessary. Trust, in its simplest form, had begun to grow. It was fragile, like frost in early spring, there for a moment, beautiful because it could break. Once, when the wind blew through the cracks in the wall, Evelyn opened her trunk to find a piece of fabric to block the draft. The photograph slipped out before she could stop it. Jonas was nearby, repairing the handle of a bucket when he saw it fall. He bent to pick it up, his thumb brushing the worn edge. The image was faded, but clear enough. A man in a suit, standing with the pride of ownership, beside a woman whose smile was small, almost shy. The resemblance was undeniable, though the woman in the picture seemed to belong to a softer world, untouched by dust or fear. Evelyn froze. For a moment, the air between them felt heavy with everything that had not been said. Jonas looked at the photograph, then at her. His eyes did not question nor accuse. He handed it back with a steady hand, his expression unreadable, but not cold. The silence that followed was long and filled with the quiet murmur of the river outside. She tucked the photograph away, and in that gesture was a surrender of sorts, not to him, but to the strange calm that had settled between them. For the first time in years, she did not feel the need to run. Nights grew longer. Sometimes through the broken window, she could see the faint glow of his fire outside, where he slept near the horse. The sound of his breathing carried through the still air. It was a simple rhythm, human and real, something that steadied her when the old fears stirred. She found herself listening for it without meaning to, as if it were proof that she was not alone in her exile. But peace in places like San Marco never lasted long. Back in town, the search had not stopped. The marshal from Austin had left, but the local sheriff, a man known for remembering small things, had begun to ask new questions. He rode out toward the edge of the hills, following a trail that others had missed, a faint line in the dirt where wagon wheels had passed, half covered by dust, but still visible to a patient eye. Near the river's bend, he found the imprint of a horse's hoof, pressed deep into the earth and filled with rainwater from a brief storm. He crouched beside it, tracing the edge with a gloved finger. When he straightened, the sun was already sinking behind the ridge. The wind carried the faint echo of water and the rustle of willows. He turned his horse toward the river, following the tracks as they vanished into the lowlands, where the land grew quiet and the shadows lengthened. The sound of the town faded behind him, replaced by the slow murmur of the water, the same river that now hid a house beneath its trees, and the two souls inside it, waiting for a future neither dared to name.
The sun had barely begun to fall when Jonas rode back to the house by the river. His horse was lathered with sweat, its breath sharp in the cooling air. He dismounted without a word, his movements stripped of hesitation. Evelyn was outside, hanging a blanket by the fire, her face turned toward the fading light. One look at him was enough. Something in his eyes, quiet, steady, unflinching, told her that the peace they had borrowed was over. He went inside first, setting down his saddlebag by the door. The silence was dense, carrying the weight of what both already knew. Evelyn followed, her hands cold despite the warmth of the fire. He did not have to say it. The air itself seemed to hold the message. They had been found. The sheriff would come with men by morning, maybe sooner. She stood still for a moment, her breath trembling, then crossed the room and began to pack. Her hands moved quickly, folding, tucking, tying knots that would have to hold through another flight. The trunk that once meant a new beginning now looked like a burden too heavy to carry. When she reached for the latch, Jonas stepped closer. He didn't speak. His hand came down on the lid of the trunk, firm, calm, final. The gesture was enough. Evelyn froze, her eyes meeting his. There was no command in his touch, no promise either. Only a question that needed no words. How long could one keep running before the road itself ran out? Outside, the wind picked up, sweeping through the willows and sending loose leaves against the window panes. The air thickened, and the house seemed to listen with them, waiting. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled low across the plains. Evelyn let her hands fall to her sides. The photograph in her pocket pressed cold against her thigh, a reminder of the life that had undone her. If she left now, she would vanish again, another name lost in the dust, another face no one remembered. But if she stayed, the road would end here, beneath this sagging roof and the man who had chosen not to ask her why she ran. That night, the fire burned low. They sat on opposite sides of it, the silence stretching like a rope between them. Shadows moved slowly across the walls, flickering against the scars of old smoke. Outside, the wind whispered, and the wind carried the smell of rain. Evelyn's voice came finally, small at first, as if pulled from a place long sealed. She told him everything, how her husband had been a man of means and temper, how a deal had gone wrong, how gold had disappeared from his ledger, and the blame had fallen squarely on her. She told him of the night she left, of the long miles and short mercies that followed. Her voice did not break. It was too tired for that. Jonas listened without moving. His face stayed in shadow, the firelight tracing the lines of his jaw, the worn leather of his jacket. When she finished, he nodded once, the way men do when they understand more than they can say. The quiet returned, heavier now, but not cruel. It filled the room like breath, steady and alive. Toward dawn, the first sound came, a distant echo carried through the trees. Then another, the sharp crack of rifles, dogs. The world outside had awakened to the hunt. Jonas rose at once, his body shifting from stillness to motion as naturally as a man rising from prayer. He slung his rifle across his back and turned to her. No words passed between them. She was already on her feet, clutching the small bundle of clothes and food she had prepared. They stepped into the cold gray light before sunrise. The air smelled of rain and gunpowder. From somewhere upriver came the hollow bark of dogs, the faint shout of men calling to one another. Jonas took her hand and pulled her toward the narrow path behind the house. The ground was slick from the night's dew, their boots sinking into mud and reeds. The sound of pursuit grew closer, hooves striking earth, voices breaking through the wind. The river lay ahead, wide and dark beneath the paling sky. Jonas waded in first, his water biting at his legs, thick with silt. Evelyn followed, her breath sharp in her chest as the current pulled at her skirt. Behind them, the dogs had found the scent, their howls cutting through the morning air. The cold was paralyzing, but she kept moving, step by step, until the far bank came within reach. The first light of dawn spilled across the horizon, painting the water in streaks of gold and silver. When they reached the other side, Jonas turned to her. His face was wet with sweat and river water, his eyes steady, unreadable. He pointed toward the slope, a patch of scrub where the hill rose to the cover of stone. She climbed without argument, her hands clutching at the grass, her lungs burning. From the top, she looked back once. Jonas was still by the river, adjusting the rifle on his shoulder. He didn't follow. The shouts grew louder now. She saw the flash of figures breaking through the trees, the glint of rifles in the morning light. Jonas moved quickly, circling the bank, keeping low. When the first of the riders reached the edge, he fired, not at them, but into the air, the sound cracking through the valley. The horses reared, snorting and spinning, their riders thrown into confusion. He fired again, then disappeared among the rocks and shadows, his form swallowed by the land he knew better than they ever would. Evelyn lay flat against the slope, her heart pounding. Below, the scene dissolved into chaos, the lawmen shouting, horses scattering, the echoes of gunfire bouncing off the hills. Then, slowly, it all began to fade, carried away by the wind and the steady murmur of the river. When silence returned, it was the deep kind, the kind that came after choices that could not be undone. She pressed her hand to the earth, feeling the tremor of her own pulse beneath the soil. The sun rose higher, turning the wet grass to gold. Somewhere down there, beyond the trees and the river, Jonas moved unseen, holding the line between her and the world that wanted her gone. She did not know if he would return, but for the first time, she understood what it meant to be saved, not by escape, but by someone who chose to stay when every road led away.
Months passed, and spring came slowly to San Marco, as it always did. The river swelled with melted snow from the northern hills, its voice steady and unhurried. Along the valley floor, new grass broke through the blackened soil where last year's fires had run wild. Life returned in quiet colors, muted greens, the pale gold of sunlight through willows, the dull silver of morning mist. The town, small and half-forgotten, spoke sometimes of the woman who had vanished months before. Some said she had drowned, others thought she had crossed the border and built a new name somewhere far away. Whatever the story, no one ever saw her again, and talk eventually faded like the echo of hoofbeats after a storm. Jonas stayed. He did not go back to the ranch where he once worked, nor to the saloons that filled their nights with smoke and noise. Instead, he settled by the river, in the house they had mended together. He repaired the roof before the rains, fixed the porch steps, and dug a small garden near the shed. His days were simple, stripped of the noise and haste that had once followed him. He rose with the sun, worked until his hands grew sore, and watched the land change its color with the seasons. Sometimes, in the early evenings, he would sit by the water with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand. The sound of the river had become his only companion, constant, patient, unjudging. It filled the silence that might have otherwise swallowed him. In town, they saw him rarely, a quiet figure who came only for salt, nails, or kerosene. Some pitied him, others envied his solitude. He paid no mind to either. The world had narrowed to the stretch of land between the hills and the river, and that was enough. One evening, when the heat had begun to soften and the sky turned the color of worn copper, a figure appeared on the trail that led to the house.
At first, it was only a shadow among the willows, barely moving, almost uncertain. Jonas stood on the porch, one hand resting on the wooden beam, and watched. The figure came closer, slow but steady, the long coat brushing against the grass. When she stepped into the light, he saw her face. Evelyn had returned. The months had changed her. The dust of long roads clung to her boots, and her coat carried the scent of places far beyond the valley. Her hair was shorter now, her expression softer, though her eyes still held the weight of all she had endured. In them lived a kind of peace, fragile, hard-won but real. She stopped a few paces away, as if testing whether the silence between them would hold. The air hung still, heavy with the scent of water and ash. She did not need to explain. The truth was written in the calmness of her stance, in the faint tremor of her breath. She was free. The law had cleared her name, the accusations had dissolved into dust, but what remained was something quieter. An emptiness, wide and deep, waiting to be filled not with noise or hope, but simply with presence. Jonas stepped aside, wordless. The house behind him stood open, light spilling from the window onto the ground like a fragile thread. She crossed the distance, her steps barely audible on the wooden boards. He took her coat, set it aside, and she sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap. For a while, they did nothing but breathe the same air, listening to the rhythm of the river outside. The past no longer chased them. The future did not call. There was only this, an evening, a roof, and the slow return of trust. The next days settled into quiet patterns. She tended the garden, patching what winter had taken. He mended tools, rebuilt the fence, and split wood for the stove. They spoke little, but the silence was different now, no longer sharp or heavy. It was the kind that made room for small things, the creak of the rocking chair, the soft clatter of dishes, the hum of insects in the dusk. When rain came, they worked side by side beneath the overhang, watching the valley fade into mist. At night, the sound of the river rose again, low and constant. Through the thin curtains, a pale light from the lantern inside spilled onto the grass, flickering with the wind. Sometimes she would stand at the window, her reflection mingling with the darkness outside. He would sit by the hearth, the quiet warmth of the fire reaching for them both. They did not speak of what had been lost or what might come. Words were too small for such things. There was a peace in their shared silence, one that neither of them had known before. It did not erase what had been done or said, but it simply allowed both to exist, side by side, like two rivers joining at the bend. The valley, once scarred by fire and pursuit, now held a different kind of stillness. The kind that grows only after long suffering, when everything unnecessary has burned away. On some nights, when the wind shifted, the faint smell of rain drifted through the open door. It carried the promise of renewal, of earth turning green again, of time continuing without demand or judgment. In the small house by the river, a lantern glowed softly against the dark. Two shadows moved within it, slow, deliberate, human. And though the world beyond the hills would go on with its noise and stories, the valley belonged to them now, to their silence, to their hard-won peace, to the quiet understanding that not every wound must be healed for life to begin again. The river kept flowing, steady and patient, carrying the memory of all that had come before, and the promise of all that could still be.